the care that went into the curating of stories for the newspaper. I had this whiteboard behind my desk for a long time where I would plan out what would go where, front page, Metro, all that. And people used to come by and laugh at it, right? Like, oh my God, you're using that antiquated, method because we had an online budgeting system.
These are in the sometime between 2010 and 2018, right?
Yeah, oh yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, everybody.
That's why they were laughing.
Everybody would come by and say, you got to get rid of that white. I mean, it was almost like it was an imperative.
It's like that.
Like I had to get rid of the whiteboard because
That's
it was
actually
like,
from the bee.
because the whiteboard was like a relic. Oh yeah, Marcia and I have walked through the old bee building.
Well, and all these chairs are from
Yes.
the bee.
Oh,
Are they really?
Yes.
So
I recognize
We didn't have chairs this nice.
They came from the bee.
the whiteboard was
Corporate
was a
maybe.
relic. It was me supposedly hanging on to the past, but really our online budgeting system was like really chaotic and not really that easy to use. It was much easier to use the whiteboard. Everybody came to look at the whiteboard all the time because it was just easier. But then the thing is that over time, as the city editor and then the Metro editor, I was told that I was not to worry, not to spend my valuable time worrying about what was going to go in the newspaper anymore. I wasn't to plan what was going to go in the newspaper anymore. It would be planned by some other people elsewhere that, by some relatively...
Well, you're leaving out a giant shift.
Well,
but
I mean,
back in the day, the newspaper, everybody in the newsroom was working
Right.
on the paper all
right.
day long.
I mean, the whole copy desk.
And there was a copy
Yeah.
desk and designers and production people and blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
By the time you got to your whiteboard, there
Yes.
was no
There
copy
was.
desk and
Right.
designers and production
There
people
were for a
anymore.
while, but
a
yes.
handful, because McClatchy did what the entire industry did. It started creating production centers, and people moved from the main newsroom into the center, and it would produce 5, 6 papers, whatever the region was, and it would have a templated design, and it would just be flowing stories in. It was just a very efficient, very different operation that continues today. The Sacramento Bee is put together back east at a McClatchy paper. It isn't even in California anymore. The first production desk was in California, but that's been gone for
But it's not
quite a few
printed in
years.
Sacramento either.
No.
Yeah.
And most newspapers are not printed.
But maybe
printed
you
in
guys
the
can
community.
speak to that I feel like every once in a while people wake up and realize that print is still relatively profitable vis-a-vis online, because all of a sudden in the last year or two, right, there's this whole reinvention print thing.
Oh yeah, that's an interesting development.
Yeah.
But just I wanted to interject. I mean, Joyce mentioned these regional production centers where the papers are put together, and you would occasionally you'd be working on a story. You'd open up your story on your computer, and the story was locked because so and so who you've never heard of has the story up and is editing it or is putting a headline on it or something. And you've never heard of this person. It turns out it's so and so out of Kansas City. So you need to call them so they can put the story down so you can go back into the story. It's like,
What? And so
and that happens so many
really
times.
that's going to be very recent.
Oh yeah.
But that just shows the difference between when we all started in that era where we kind of look back as it being the just real high point of a lot of newsrooms and certainly of the Bee, where it was so independent. I mean, nothing like that would even have been possible because nobody would have had access to what you were doing in Sacramento, much less purposeful access. And then now it really is a corporate-wide effort to do print and to keep costs down as much as they are. And to answer your husband's question, I mean, what evolved over the last few years is, so when you look at the giant cost of doing print and then the audience becoming markedly smaller for it, so it doesn't really support the same kind of investment by any company. You go bankrupt every day. You have to find ways to be efficient. One is to do these production centers and to take a lot of the creativity out of doing print and just making it templated and doing all of that. And cutting back on how much copy editing you do, how many editors look. I mean, there was a time when stories would have on average story 5 or 6 eyes before it would get in print, and now it has one basically, and that's your line editor. There's no copy editor, so there's that. But the other thing is that everybody started closing their printing presses, and then they'd have a, like at one point the Bee was printing out a lot of newspapers because the Bee was making money off of that, but at a certain point they even closed the Bee and it's now printed elsewhere. And when you have one press room doing a lot of papers, it dramatically changes the deadline. And so when we used to be able to go as late as 1 a.m. for the daily paper, if there was a giant story, you could, on election night, it was always 1 a.m. for the last edition. And then, it starts creeping up, and it's 8 o'clock, and then it's 6 o'clock, and then it's 5 o'clock. And there are some papers that get printed at maybe 1 in the afternoon, or probably even in the morning, depending on what paper it is, for the next day. So then that actually makes the news about 2 days old.
Yeah. I think the deadline is probably around 3 or 4 now.
About the time I left, the reporter's deadline, unless it was some cataclysmic story, the deadline was about 3.
Yeah.
2:30 or 3.
Probably 5 o'clock printing is my guess.
Something like that.
This brings up for me the unanswerable question of in what ways is the Bee relevant in Sacramento now, when and the newspaper itself is, like you're describing, something that's less relevant. And I wondered about this in the last few years of my career when we realized that our circulation, our subscriber numbers were so low in this metropolitan area of 2 million people. I just thought of this now as one, is that in some cases the Bee is not listened to or not gone. People don't go to it necessarily. Nobody's just going, I'm going to wake up this morning and go to the Bee's front page on the website. I don't think anybody thinks that. We send out newsletters.
I do it every morning.
I think among elected officials, among policymakers, among people inside the Capitol, I think it still matters.
Well, I'm not saying we don't matter, but I was just saying that, what I felt like we started to become more relevant on breaking news than we ever could have been before. Mm-hmm. So, Bill and I would come in at 7 a.m. on a big story, and we would be adding to that story all day long. And we know that we got people reading and rereading that story. And I felt this connection with readers and this immediacy, or that I was being beneficial to readers in a way that I'd never been before in the newspaper days, that that today's the day that counts, not tomorrow morning. But I'm not sure. No, I didn't think that people go to sacb.com to look at our front page. Maybe we've started. This is under you. Started putting out newsletters, emails, telling people what we have today. That's how I get my news. The New York Times, the Los Angeles Times Chronicle, the Bee send me newsletters each morning. Cal Matters, and I look through those to see. I do feel that we lost that, I'm going to grab the Bee and look at it like this, whether it's the newspaper or the online product.
You can't, a newspaper has a beginning and an end, and very fast skimming, right? So it's just an entirely different experience. And in the olden days, for all of you youngsters listening to this, you could read a paper and know pretty much everything you need to know to go about your day and to be on top of what's going on in the world. It's been a long time since even the papers that still do print offer that kind of experience. And the problem with online is it is both too limiting and too limitless. Limiting if you're in an app which has the best experience, you're not dealing with all the problems of many websites that still are difficult to read. But like the Bee's new app is pretty limited on how many stories get kept in each topic, right? And so you can easily miss stories. And that's true of other news operations as well. And if you're on the site and you just keep reading, or if they don't limit it, it's just this constant flow, and other stuff that's not as important might take the place of stuff, and you might still miss something. So when you have that experience, it is the issue of how much influence a paper has is just very different, because people are reading so differently. And so it's one, how many people are reading? And we know it is what, about maybe a fifth of what it used to be, or
Something like that.
yeah, I mean it is a markedly smaller subscriber base than what it used to be. And there will be some leakage, and some people will be reading some stuff for free. Or other mediums, other companies might be picking up the B, so you still have some influence that way. But to your point, the influencers, I think, still pay attention.
I think that's right.
You think, from the recent election, that you flat out saw elections affected by Sacramento Bee endorsements.
I did, yes. I mean, I think in a few things. I think that influencers in this town and people in power absolutely still read the Bee, and that even editorials, which you don't think of as being that widely read, if in this particular election season the Bee targeted one particular measure and opposed it and hammered away at it, I'm thinking that it probably defeated it. I personally, I get up in the morning and this all has a negative tone in the sense that it's about one newspaper and the decline of that newspaper and everything else. But on the other hand, the world of information has been opened up to us in a way that is, it's disturbing in its fragmentation, but it's also like way bigger. Like I subscribe online for very little money to the Chronicle, the LA Times, the Bee, the Washington Post, the New York Times, and then all the myriad of free, news sources. Every day I check all 5 of those. I do check the Bee's front page. I get the newspapers, letters too. So in the aggregate, I read way more than I used to.
Oh yeah, I do too.
I may not read like the thumbsucker necessarily. That I would say
Can
is
we call that something else?
that I would say is the hardest. That I would say is the hardest thing. There's so much competition now, right? That unless it has directly to do with me, my boss, my job, my city, I'm looking at those headlines and I'm making a decision. Like, is this story worth my time, right? It's not just laid out in front of me in a newspaper. It's like, does that headline, is that going to be worth the investment of the 10, 15 minutes of my time that I'm going to have to spend on it? Is it sufficiently relevant? Is it about a topic that I care enough about? And so I think probably the stories that suffer the most are those ones we might have done just because they have like a niche interest and written like 100 inches about, because that's really hard online and people aren't really going to do that. There was this weekend, as in the last couple of days, an exception to that, a story that normally, honestly, probably I would not have clicked through on, but it just got a little intrigued. It was a story that the Bee did about a woman in Yuba City? Was it Yuba City? It was her husband was the police chief.
The wife.
Yeah.
The wife.
Yeah.
And her siblings were all told the lead was great. It really pulled you in. And the siblings were all told that she killed herself, and suspicion developed over time that he had in fact murdered her.
Right.
And this is going to be a serial. And the way that it ended was pretty good too. Like I'll read the next one.
Yeah.
So, but I think those stories have to be really super compelling now to get you to read them, because there's just so much competition.
Well, they always had to be super compelling. There was just no way to measure.
There's no way to know if people read them or not.
Right.
Right.
And so who knows how different actually readership is than it used to be.
And now we have the hard paywall on certain stories,
Right.
where you have, there's most readers get the benefit of what's called the metered paywall, where you get 5 free clicks a month, something like that. And the idea is you read so much and you fall in love with the Bee, so you subscribe.
Sure.
Then there are stories that are exclusive to subscribers only, and they don't get very much readership as a rule, because people don't bother to subscribe. You're only getting the people who are already subscribing, and that can be sort of deflating if you spent 3 months on a thumbsucker that doesn't get very well read.
No, it's true.
It's
right,
deflating
because
for the
because they might
reporter.
come for that. you might get those people for that, but then they can't get through. So
Yeah,
But can we get back to the whole notion of influence? I think that's
Yeah.
how we started. It's like, what's the position
But
of the
influence,
paper now?
but influence
It's built on readership.
It's built.
I know.
It's built on page views and
Sure.
who's out there reading.
Sure.
I will say the one thing that I noticed throughout this last election is how many ads said the Sacramento Bee endorses
oh sure,
this.
yeah.
So it didn't matter.
it does.
Yeah.
That's
know.
classic. That's always been the case.
Yeah.
And yes, I mean, what you're saying is the bee is greatly diminished, but it has these roots in this community. It is that, what is it, that it has built a brand that is surviving. And it's not just the brand that's surviving, it is the fact that this is still a serious newspaper that sends reporters out every day to try to do their best to tell people what's immediately interesting to them, whether it's the election, whether it's the wildfire hitting into your town,
Or the male men getting attacked by turkeys.
Turkeys.
which was fascinating.
I really enjoyed that
Well,
story.
I actually felt
Okay,
like
what-
calling because that happened before. I edited a story like that like 10 years ago where a turkey got bludgeoned by a male man.
Yeah.
Do you remember that?
Yes, we're getting off track here.
We're getting
But-
off track. But
So there is nothing new under the sun, is what
Right,
you're saying.
no.
All right.
Turkeys are ornery what times.
I think it's fair to say the paper still has influence, as evidenced by the recent election.
COVID also did this. I mean, COVID,
Yeah.
we saw how important we could be. We saw our number, because you can measure online. We have these. We can measure how many people are reading each story, and our numbers
you went through
exploded.
Yeah.
Everybody was reading what we had.
People were
And it
home
was
and
an
had time to read.
interesting time because a month
Yeah.
before the pandemic started is when McClatchy finally went Chapter 11. That's when the bankruptcy filing was just
Wow.
a few weeks before. So we were dealing with that on one level,
Yeah.
and then we were sent home. And I don't know about you, but the idea, that seemed intimidating at first. Like, oh my God, I can't work from home.
Intimidating, huh?
Just like, what would I do? I couldn't, I needed an office to go to.
I felt like at that point we had our office. Our office was
I
with
know.
us wherever we went.
Well, I didn't realize
and
that
our
until I got
iPads
home.
and yeah.
And we put out pretty good product for 2 years under pretty difficult circumstances.
You never
I
went
should-
back to the building again.
We never went back to that
Never
building
to 2100
because
East Street.
McClatchy surrendered that building
Yeah.
into bankruptcy. So we spent
And-
a year and a half just working from home, and it
And we
created
did
its
well.
own. It created its own form of camaraderie in a way,
Yeah.
and we did really well, I thought. And
I
then
thought so.
spring of 2022, they opened the new office on Alhambra.
And how much were you there?
Not very often.
Yeah.
And it became a chicken and egg thing. Because I'd go in, it's a nice space.
It's a really
It's
nice
a very
space.
nice space.
But
Yeah.
nobody's there.
And not very many people go in,
Yeah.
Even now.
even now.
Even now.
Well, I can only give you
That
as
is
of 2 weeks
2 weeks.
ago.
That is
But anyway.
not unique to the Bee or to the
Yeah.
newspaper industry.
Right, but it
That's
was-
just-
Or to
that's-
any corporation right,
Right.
now,
Right.
or even the government.
But
That's-
Yeah.
just the way things are.
I'd go in
Yeah.
and well, why am I here? I can do my work from home.
It's a
The-
cool space.
It's a cool space,
Yeah.
but the camaraderie, the kinship, just
Yeah.
sort of the
And that's a big part of
people
newsrooms.
standing
part
around,
of the
just
newsroom. It's
kind of
hard to
bullshitting
imagine.
around, that
Yeah.
all went away.
So-
And the Bee needs to kind of recreate its newsroom culture, and I hope it does.
So you two were there, for quite a while after I left. And you and I left almost the same time in 2018. And what, can you give us a sense of just like, you talked about the pandemic, but even before you went home from the pandemic, of just kind of like what it's like to be a journalist right now with the Sacramento Bee and under new ownership, not a long time newspaper family, not a publicly held company where you get to know numbers and that sort of thing. But you've seen good changes, right? Some recent hiring. And,
Yes. I mean, you now have a deep-pocketed
Yeah.
hedge fund Again, I'm not sure they're, this benevolent operation, but at least they've brought some.
Generally, they're not.
Right, but they've brought stability that the
Right.
the McClatchy
Yeah.
family no longer could provide.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, granted, they were there as lenders and investors for the previous decade anyway.
Sure.
It's not like they just showed up as the White Knights. They were part and parcel of all the cutbacks that were
Absolutely.
taking place. Nevertheless, they brought some stability. There's some hiring going on. It's never going to be what it was. It's
Right.
never going to be 300 journalists.
It's not even going to be 100 journalists.
Right. It's fewer
Right.
than 100.
I'm fixated on what it got down to. Joyce said that we had more than 300 people in our news operation during our peak. Did it get down to 70? I think it got
yeah.
below.
Oh
my God, way below
Definitely got below
70.
70.
I may have gotten below 50.
Yeah.
I'm not totally sure.
For
You
me,
know,
Because there were so
Part-
many people who were how did you count the person
How do
who
you
worked
count?
who worked for McClatchy generally?
Exactly.
What was in the-
It's just structured differently.
Yeah.
And so people who actually are physically in Sacramento might not be working just for Sacramento and actually often aren't. But it also is an unfair comparison because the way print was produced changed. And that whole operation, essentially, that part of the newsroom left. And that was a good chunk of the newsroom.
But it also at the same time, the Bee very much narrowed its focus on what its lane was going to be. We had a whole feature section all gone. We reviewed movies, we reviewed news. We don't restaurants. We name all the things that we discovered that we didn't really.
Home and garden, theater.
Even sports, to a degree.
Right, and I
Yeah.
wouldn't say that readers didn't want those things.
No.
I just think that as, in my 7 years where it felt like all I was doing was cutting back, because that is the era in which I was in that job, you just have to kind of over and over and over again reassess what are the most important things to give to this community.
We
in
had
this.
a lot of sessions.
We had a lot of sessions about what are the most important topics, either from the perspective of people are most interested in them or they are essential to newspaper coverage. Things like, I think, providing accountability, especially to politicians, and paying attention to education, and some of those kind of core beats we deemed essential. But yeah, that doesn't mean people don't like reading sports, because they do, but can you compete, other than the very local stuff, can you compete against ESPN? No, you can't, really. And then features, I mean, if you think back to how Eleanor McClatchy was such a proponent of the arts in town, and for years and years and years, we were told repeatedly by theaters and various others that our ticket sales are completely affected by whether you cover us or not. And then you just end up having to cut the coverage. I mean, it's just so painful in so many ways.
When they at the beginning, a lot of the arts organizations complained, right? They were
Rightly
really
so.
upset.
Rightly so. But there weren't a lot of options as we were going through all those cuts.
Yeah.
Just brought home to me that Dale and I were, and you too, were just situated in the heart of what our business
Yeah.
to me ended up being about, and that is breaking news, government accountability, enterprise reporting around those things, and so much of the other things we did. That the newspaper was a wonderful all-purpose package back in the day.
Sure.
And now, to stay at the Bee, I had to make the bet that I wasn't going to get laid off.
Yeah. Right.
That if when we went into bankruptcy, we weren't going to close down. Because I don't know if you all had that same fear. I had the concern that they could actually close this newspaper down.
I left and came back.
Yeah, because
Yeah, before it got to that
No,
point. Yeah.
well, it was pretty bad. I mean, it was pretty like. I was like 40 something. I was in my mid 40s.
It was
I guess.
during the Great Recession.
Well, yeah,
so
just
things were bleak.
Yeah, things were bleak. My husband had gotten laid off, and revenues were falling off the cliff, and so I got a job in the state senate, and I left. And before I left, before I had actually walked out the door, that big layoff was announced.
Yeah.
Which made it super awkward because, the whole goodbye when I wasn't, and then leaving. But but then at some point it became clear, like I was only gone 6 months, and it became clear that we weren't immediately going to close. Do you know what I mean? Like,
And you're going to get a big promotion.
well, there was that, but we weren't immediately going to close. So if you could just sort of suspend the terror, you know, you could, and also be like confident you could find another job, right? Like if you. So that's, I think, a hard thing. But, you know, you still see young people going into it now. They've got to feel that way, right? So I decided to come back, and I was back another 10 years, all in editing. But
I do think if you come into the profession now, there are all kinds of options. So you do have companies like McClatchy and the Bee, which have gone through this just very, very tough couple of decades. But then you have all the new startups like Cal Matters, which has probably
People
more
move
people now than the Bee has.
people move around a lot too.
Yeah.
Like people at the Bee, that's the thing. The Bee used to be such a company in town. It was such a weird place. Like I moved 5 times in 5 years after getting done with graduate school before coming here. Thought I would be out of here in 2 years, and ended up there for 27, right? And that happened to everybody, right? Everybody ended up staying in the
Everybody
Bee.
here anyway.
Yeah,
Around this
but a
table.
lot more people in the newsroom. Like it was a place where people stayed 25, 30 years.
As was Sacramento, a place where you could buy a house, start a
Right.
family,
Yeah.
and then you've got roots.
It was one of my recruiting lines that Sacramento sucked you in.
That's fascinating. Exhilarating city.
Sounds frightening.
I want to follow up on a point Tony made about, you know, the Bee becoming more focused and more sort of narrow casting a little. The Bee is still trying to figure out what it is.
Well, so is the whole industry.
Right. But I mean, that's probably, if we do this oral history thing 100 years from now, well, different people will be having the same conversation, you know, of the Bee trying to figure out what it is, because we made a brief reference to this Print Reimagined initiative,
Right.
which launched in 2021, which now 3 days a week, it's kind of a magazine format with a cover story. And, you know, the Friday cover, in fact, is an attempt to sort of recreate some of that feature section a little bit, because it may have a restaurant orientation. It's more of a lifestyle orientation. It's sort of, you know, preparing you for the weekend and having a great weekend in Sacramento. And so they're still clinging to the print product in a way.
Well,
You know, as much as they say they're not, they are.
you know, the whole issue is at what point do you stop print in terms of how much money you're getting from it versus, you know, if it's producing revenue, it's not going to go away anytime soon. But the reimagining is focused on the days of the week that make the most money.
Sure.
So it is set up for a gradual pulling back should the company decide to do that.
Here's something that, if I could, was this in 2019 or 2020? I can't remember now, but I can't believe we haven't mentioned it yet. The Bee stopped publishing on Saturdays.
Oh, that's right.
Right. Well,
And
that's
at the-
my
and at-
point about the
I think
3
that-
days.
But the point
Yeah.
is, at the time, it was like this big, oh my God,
Yeah.
can we do that? And still survive? What's going to happen?
Yeah.
And frankly, nothing happened. You know, everybody's, you know, like 6 people canceled their subscription or some crazy small number like that.
So part of the whole transition and evolution in revenue was to start gradually and then pretty sharply increasing the price of subscriptions. And this market got subscriptions for some people up to as high as like $1,000 a year, which was just pretty, I mean, that's just a whole lot of money. And it was doing kind of like airplane pricing for seats. Not everybody paid the same amount, and it
Right.
kind of depended on what people could pay to a certain extent. And so when you start then rolling back some of the print, it really kind of depends on what your subscription costs are at that time. So any fear about taking a day out depends on how many people are paying the higher end of the cost versus the lower end. And then of course now the company's it's moving to gradually increase the price of digital, because a lot of companies they need digital revenues to be higher to be able to lose print.
Right.
And I don't know of the print readers. I know the print readership is way lower than it used to be. But I don't have any idea, and it would be interesting to know if you guys do, if how many of them are primarily dependent on print readership versus it's just a habit and they haven't canceled it, but they're gradually reading more and more digitally.
Do any of you get the print paper?
I get print, but I almost never read it.
Okay, but
Yeah.
you get it down?
I get it. I rarely read it.
Right, that's why I
Because
stopped
I've already
getting
read the stories
Because I rarely read it.
in most
Yeah.
cases. But, if you want that crossword,
You can
I
play
do the
that
crossword
online.
online.
you know
I do
what?
all my puzzles online now.
Figuring out the PDF and printing out the crossword is a pain in the neck.
No, you just do it right in the New York Times app. You don't
Yeah.
have to print anything out.
They've got the spelling bee thing too. It's great. That's another thing.
I
this
got a
Games
green
Revolution.
bee yesterday.
Holy
I've got Genius a bunch of times, but I
I get that.
Queen
I'm
bee.
retired. I have
You
more
got
time.
Queen bee. I didn't even know there was that.
I didn't
oh,
either.
That was 35
actually.
words, yes. That was I got 33 out of the 35.
I finally
I'm sure
got
they're going
the
to print
final
this.
two.
But then you have,
And you were complaining when we wandered off topic?
yeah.
I think these are the good bits. These are the good bits. We all
This is
play
the only thing that they'll keep. Everything else
I have a
think
good
this
bit to
means
conclude
it's time
my
for your
portion.
question.
All right, let's hear from Tony.
I mean, we could keep going, but just if you want some insight into the mentality in the newsroom over time. Boy, when the Great Recession hit and the first round of layoffs came and the first talk of, we're past being dinosaurs, now could we go bankrupt? My wife told me, watch Dale Castler. If Dale Castler leaves the bee, you leave. Because Dale was covering the bankruptcy.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay.
And
Oh,
he never left.
interesting.
So you were good.
Even when I thought,
So you finally got bored and you left.
yeah, I finally gave up waiting for you. I had to leave. But as Dale and I were talking, oh yeah, you thought about maybe, do I go somewhere else for stability? And no, this for us, and you came back. It's the best job in town.
Yeah, loved it. I mean, loved it, and I loved those last 10 years. It was fun. Well, in a way, it was more fun because there was less bureaucracy, and you could do whatever the hell you wanted to.
You just throw it in. And,
I mean, really,
Throw
it
it
was
in.
like there just was way more flexibility and kind of a lot of creativity that went on, and it was really, immediate. Plus the energy, right? The
Well, you
energy
could-
of the breaking news and
You
stuff
could
was fun.
compete against television.
Yes, yes.
and
Or
make TV.
compete directly against the LA Times.
Yeah.
When
No, and I recognize I don't really do it very much anymore. I can remember, on a good day, I'd be walking to the newsroom just like snapping my fingers, right? Like,
Oh, Bill Lindelof told me he shows up at work at 5:30. You two are by 6 a.m. You're both calling him. You're like, we gotta have this. We gotta do this. Do this now. Yeah. So yes, it started furiously
no,
early.
because it's fun. It's fun to break news. Dale loves to break news online. Boy, you run across the newsroom, you come running. Really, there's hardly anything that makes me happier than it's super fun.
Or goofier
Just
looking.
or the way that you would pace and back your editor. Like, is it online yet? Did you post it yet? Did you post it yet?
I remember seeing that.
No, I mean people.
Really?
It really gets people's adrenaline going, and it does tap into a lot of what reporters really like, and that's just to break news and to
Well, I remember in those first few years of being online, didn't the story have to, you had to send an email to someone or
You
something?
did used to,
Like, it
and
was
then
so
they
primitive.
would post, and it would take forever.
Right, it would take 15 minutes
no,
for a
that's
story
true.
to go online because
Yeah.
the system was so damn primitive.
Yeah, well, I remember we lost some scoops to other
Yes,
papers
we did.
because
Yes.
it would be sitting there waiting to
Yes.
upload or something. It wasn't it was on a rhythm of how it uploaded or something.
Right, because it only could upload stuff every 15 minutes or
Right.
something.
It was
I
a
don't
content
remember
studio, which was the thing where we got the ability to post directly. I think that was Content Studio, and
I left before you guys started doing
no,
Q.
Q
which
came
was,
later.
Q was really fast.
Q was
right?
really fast. Q, theoretically, any of you could have posted from anywhere, anytime. We just didn't
Well,
really
we sometimes-
advertise that.
Guess who found out about that?
And we
Well,
sometimes
Yeah.
did, yes, reporters in the new system, the system that exists
Yeah.
today, could actually publish their own
Yeah.
stories should they so desire.
Well, and you can edit it from your iPhone for
Right,
the field.
right.
Yeah.
One
And write it.
One practical aspect of that is that when we lost our copy editors, and the copy editors didn't get much respect, but boy, once they were gone, the
Oh, God,
mistakes
Yeah,
Oh,
the
that got
typos.
into typos and things like that. And
Yeah.
I'd publish a story.
Mm-hmm.
I have barely time to go to the bathroom, and I
And
get
then you got-
emails from readers saying,
Right.
"You idiot," and then I would type, "Thank you for being my copy editor today," and I
Yeah.
would jump in the story, fix it, and republish it without.
I still do it.
Yeah.
I do it all the time, and to people because I know that they can go in and fix it, and
Yeah.
I don't want it to get into print. So if I'll see stuff, I just text people directly and be like, "Fix this, fix that," which is probably really annoying, but I think helpful.
No, I think it's, no need to tell the editor.
No, right? Just tell her big words, right? Yeah.
These just misspellings or grammar.
Yeah.
It's not like it's a factual error, but
We never
you said,
make factual
I
errors
do that for
twice.
those two.
Oh, yeah.
Ever make factual error,
Yeah.
ever.
yeah.
I'm just sitting here thinking of how many times I emailed or texted somebody and asked them to fix a story, and I've tried so hard not to do that since
Oh, since
I
you-
have left. But there are times when I do, where I see like the nut graph, the biggest point of the story, and they've left out words.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Or they said it, and you're sure they said it backwards from what they intended to say it based on your reading of it, and I just can't help myself that.
Yeah, my experience is people are actually always appreciative because they
Readers have always
Yeah.
called in and
Yeah.
said, you know, even when it was in print,
Right.
is
People
this
love to
what you
correct.
meant to say?
People,
Yeah.
But it was a way of becoming closer to the readers. You know, there was when I first got into journalism, our stories were like delivered from on high. We'll
Right,
explain
yes,
to you the world.
yes.
And by the time I left, I'd be writing readers would say. The interaction with the readers would cause me to say, oh, "Okay, I'm going to make some changes."
Right.
Where these stories are iterations, and I felt like, we want to have a relationship with the readers. They were kind of empowered towards the end. I think even in your time, I think I felt like I had the kind of relationship with readers that I really wanted.
Oh yeah.
Well, that's why we link to source documents in the stories.
Right.
Because frankly, the reader no longer takes our word for it anymore.
Oh yeah.
They want to see the indictment or the city council staff report or whatever it is.
The judge's full ruling.
Right. Yeah.
And it might not just be that they don't believe what you've written. It's just people have access to all kinds of information
But I
now.
think
and
there
if
is
it's a topic you're interested in, you do want to
Yes,
go in and
but
read
there
it all.
there is a skepticism now
There is amongst
that that didn't always used to
But
be
the,
there.
the other
Really
app,
think so?
what?
I mean, I find that questionable that there's skepticism now because people seem to accept news
Yeah, they seem to
from
buy
and just
everything.
take whatever is put out there without questioning it at all.
Sure, but maybe
But-
they
but they
don't
will-
question it from the
Yeah.
source that they agree with.
Right,
and
they,
maybe
they
they're
are
reading it.
they are highly skeptical of something that they don't believe in or disagree with.
Yeah.
And 20, 30 years ago, I think there was at least a certain sense, at least among a certain critical mass of readership, that, well, if it was in the B, it's probably true.
Yeah.
Well, I get that's kind of what I'm getting back. I think of when I was growing up and how Walter Cronkite was the most trusted man in America.
Right.
Okay, they even wanted him to run for president a few
Yeah.
times.
Sure.
Who is that now? I mean, how is news? It's so splintered. I
Right.
mean, you're either on this side or you're on that side, and where's the middle ground?
Well,
That-
there isn't any more. Walter Cronkite wouldn't be himself today. He would be that mainstream media that is trying to control what we know. So there isn't. Well, there isn't that.
Right.
But you've got. So my own thing that drives me crazy, to me, the news is opinion, constant opinion of somebody saying this and that, and how much of it is it just reporting?
Right. Well, particularly some of I hate to pick on them, but the cable news channels, the national ones. I mean, it's not just Fox News. It's all of
CNN,
them.
yeah,
CNN, MSNBC. It drives you nuts. You can't. There's one little nugget of news, and they dissect it with people bloviating for an hour.
Thank you.
Over this one little thing. So that kind of, I think that has contributed to an environment in which people are generally skeptical of, they just think that everything is biased one way or the
You
other.
can't have somebody as president for 4 years and on the campaign trail before and after talk about the media as the enemy of the people and just go on a tirade every time he disagrees with something and not have that actually affect people's viewpoints. Not just of his passionate followers, but of everybody. It just kind of, it seeps into the culture, I think. I wrote a column after all of you guys were working on this, but after the Oroville Dam catastrophe, because it had that was kind of around the time where we were hearing so much of that enemy of the people stuff, and it was just really kind of draining. And I wrote a column about it, just basically about, you guys are driving up into a potential catastrophe. I mean, everybody who went up to cover that was going the opposite way of everybody who was fleeing and potentially in danger and stuck in traffic and all of that. And, my point of writing it was that we are not enemies of anybody here. We're doing our damnedest every day to just kind of, serve the community and get information and all of that. But yes, I think there's been damage.
That was a fun night.
And that was quite a night.
That was an incredible night.
But my sense, even in these last few years, when this question of truth, or fake news. And tell me if you felt the same ways. I do feel that I had trust of readers. If I'm not a pundit, I'm not out giving opinions, I'm not spinning anything. I'm basically trying to keep what I do as, here's what's happening right here. Here's some lay out some factual information, try to bring in perspective people's points of view and write it in a way that makes people say, okay, it makes sense what this guy's presenting. I felt like I had trust for the most part of my readers because I was keeping it pretty narrow in a way, staying close to, all right, you guys need to know this. I don't know. Does that make sense?
By and large, but you'd get emails from the fake news crowd. At least I did.
Yeah, water issues.
Sure.
Yeah.
Whatever.
But if we're writing about, yes, no, it's true. When we had the Black Lives Matter and Stephon Clark, and I felt like I was out there reporting what was going on, people could not see that in an unbiased manner. We had viewers and readers who were just, they would dissect your sentences. And why'd you use that word?
There was some of that, sure.
Oh, the word riot. Gosh,
Oh, I was still there for that.
Yeah.
For that first, because I switched jobs right in the middle of that whole Stephon Clark thing. Yeah, the word riot and the word, what was it? Oh, a protest turned ugly or something. And it became this huge thing because there's some connotations around the word ugly that people weren't aware of.
Oh, yeah.
No, it like, words become so charged and you have to be so careful about word choice and think about all the ramifications of that.
Yeah.
That was an explosive situation in which people, a lot of other stuff got wrapped up in that, people's feelings.
I'd like to think that some of the anger directed at us from both sides, how we used the word riot or something, did reflect that they were really looking for us for, to be a mature voice in the middle of this, even if they were haranguing us at the same time. I'd like to think that's still the case.
Well, I think though, looking historically at the Bee, and Chad and I have been working on a project about the Ku Klux Klan, and the Bee played a very critical role in the 1920s, 100 years ago, almost exactly, in trying to defeat that movement. And so where's the role of investigative journalism in our community, which that was all about Sacramento. That wasn't on some big national level. That was what was happening here. And bringing that to the forefront. How is the newspaper, and I wrote down, how is the newspaper part of the community? You're eliminating all these things, like you eliminated sports and the feature sections and things like that. Those things reflected the culture in the community. Where does that go? and how many people have access to that anymore?
I think that there are still really good stories done that are investigative in nature, but it tends to be like, it's just interesting to watch it from the outside now, like one reporter's particular interest, or there'll be like a whole bunch of deep coverage on one topic area, but like there'll be a handful of topic areas on which like if you have a really good reporter on something, you're going to do a great job. If you have Dale on water, or like Tony on transportation or housing, they're going to dig in really deep. It's hugely dependent on who you have, and if you don't have that many really good people, then a lot of other topics are going to suffer. There are some areas in this city, there are some topics, there are some organizations, there are some branches of government that are almost entirely uncovered. Anything could be happening, virtually anything. And then there are others that are, not maybe as well covered as they used to be, but pretty well covered. So it depends,
I mean, it's the issue with staffing, right?
Yeah.
And it is, the paper is very small compared to what it used to be. But I also think it's fair to say that there were periods of time when it wasn't doing necessarily that much accountability work anyway. I always thought it was the single biggest public service a newspaper could do, and the kind of work that a lot of other media, they're just not doing it. So it was always a priority of mine. I think it was for Rick's before I was editor. I have watched a certain amount of emphasis continue, even as the newsroom has become even smaller. There is an editor in charge of accountability work and reporters assigned to that, and still good work being done by those reporters. Something I wrote a few years ago is, so the best work is still good, there's just not enough of it.
It's triage is the
It's
word.
triage.
And to make choices.
You have to make choices. And so then, the issue is, so where does that leave a community? And I don't think anybody knows the answer to that now. I mean, you can look around, and it's not just the US, it's everywhere, right? But if you just look around the US, there are entire swaths of states that don't have coverage that's local. And then there are some bright spots here and there where they're still doing great. They tend to be locally owned operations with billionaire money behind them, and they can still afford to have good staffs. So I think that the Bee is doing, I think, the best we could expect out of it right now, because we are seeing some very good stories, and we are seeing the kind of key beats being covered locally. Some good hires in recent times, since the bankruptcy is a thing of the past. But I just kind of look at it and wonder where it'll be in 5 years.
Well, and what the model's going to be because people you've got the billionaire model like the LA Times, right? Or Jeff Bezos buying the Washington Post. You've got some papers going nonprofit. The Sun Times in Chicago is now owned by the public radio station.
Well, and in
Salt Lake City,
in
where
Plymouth.
Lauren went. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So it's, but it's hard to know, it ultimately, unless papers can make money with ads and online, and they, so far they haven't really been able to successfully sustain that.
I mean, you do have things like, operations like Cal Matters, which did not exist, you
Right.
know.
But that's all
a decade
philanthropic
ago.
It's a
dollars, right?
nonprofit, it's all.
It's
Yeah.
nonprofit. It is doing incredibly well, and it is doing investigations
It
as
does
part of
good
its
work.
mission.
Yeah.
It does very, very good
It's
work.
sort of, in a weird sort of way, it saddens me. Because basically, what should be a profitable, prosperous business is reduced to charity.
Was it always flawed though? The fact that this whole sort of kind of a virtuous, kind of mission-driven exercise was built on a for-profit chassis that depended on selling ads And so, was that flawed from the get-go? Is that not a sustainable model for forever?
Well, it sure
Well,
wasn't a sustainable model for a long time.
I know
We're definitely
And I would also like to point out some of the most successful newspapers in California, but in the United States, New York, have all been run by millionaires.
Yes.
I mean, Hearst, let's give
Right.
an example.
Sure.
Noland in Oakland. Those were wealthy, wealthy people, and
Yes.
they were able to invest. And part of it was that they made
Right.
politicians. I mean,
Right.
here,
Sure.
C.K. McClatchy was
Sure.
so tied to
Sure.
Hiram Johnson. I mean, all of those things have been intertwined. So to say there was a non-biased, pure period,
Right.
money was always part of this option. So,
And influence. With all the discussion in today's world about whether an outlet is conservative or liberal, if you go way, way back politically, everybody was one or the other, right?
Right, 100 years ago, you did not read like an unbiased publication.
And if you go way back,
Yeah,
it was tiny.
yeah,
So if you look at the arc of history and the evolution, it really was only this big, fat, and happy with a ton of
Right.
resources for
Yeah.
about what, a decade and a half maybe, or something
yeah,
like
it's
that.
got, I mean, it builds up, right? So it's like 20
Yeah.
years, 20 years of really incredibly like national aspiration type,
Sure.
huge newsroom, spending all this money.
but still playing, like, historically, most cities up until, the mid 20th century had multiple newspapers
yeah.
Right.
that played off of each other.
Yeah.
And you
Yeah.
can look
Yeah.
at
and have different personalities.
right, you can look at significant events in those
Yeah.
communities, and I give redevelopment here as one of those, where those two newspapers sat on opposite sides
Right.
the whole time. But it allowed for perspective,
Yeah,
from both sides. I mean, historically that was the case. I mean, Abraham Lincoln even bought a newspaper so he could be more influential
Right.
at one point. So that was the key role that it played. But to say that it was never biased is, I
No,
think,
we
naive.
lived through a period where, I mean, there was a very, very, like, bright line between the publisher's office and I mean, really, there was an effort. Humanity is humanity, so it's impossible to actually do what, to eliminate bias but there was a huge effort to at least be completely fair, you weren't influenced by,
Sure, but
Yeah.
I think what you're talking about is if you look at what a mission is of a paper,
Yeah.
a lot of journalists say their
Oh,
mission, the reason they're attracted to it is to comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable, right?
it is inherent.
You could argue
Yes.
that inherently
It
is
is.
bias,
Yes,
right?
right.
And so papers that kind of take on that as a mission versus the Wall Street Journal, which is
Right.
got a very different mission, that kind of thing, there is a very
No, that's true.
huge difference
Yeah.
in the types of stories that
But
reporters do.
there was the natural bias in the ownership, the William Randolph Hearsts, all of
Yeah.
they wanted to have the newspaper for the editorial page.
Right.
Right.
Was they can.
So did the McClatchys.
Oh, I'm not. I'm saying them all,
Yeah.
all of them. Yes, I mean that seems to be. I came in saying we don't need editorial writers, and so they're a problem. But that's the reason people start papers.